the lawlessness, disobedience, hooliganism, and anarchy that we have seen in the streets of many capital cities around the world and the campuses in the United States and beyond have been incredibly alarming. People who totally undermine authority, undermine authority of the campus security, don't listen to lawful behavior, civil disobedience, hooliganism, taking over swaths of campuses and public spaces which they're not allowed to, that only the police force or sometimes even federal forces have had to dismantle. The rise in anarchy and disobedience is alarming. We saw also the same phenomenon leading up to October 7th, Simchat Torah. We've seen in Israel, not only in campuses abroad, but we've seen in Israel that the whole debates about the judicial reform, pro and against, led leaders then and even some in the periphery today to still call for civil disobedience, called Meri Ezrachi, to tell people that if things don't go your way, bring the house down, and if need be, bring society down in order to make change. The truth is that this thinking is a cogent political philosophy known as anarchy. And anarchists, as explained by arguably today's most famous anarchist and influential Noam Chomsky, the famous professor, linguistic philosopher, who says in his book on anarchy or anarchism, and he says as follows. He says that our problem is with authority. Authority is inherently flawed, and the only way authority can justify itself is it has to self-justify the whole time. Who can live like this? He says if it doesn't self-justify, you have to dismantle it. Those are his words. Can we wake up in the morning as leaders or people who have got any type of authority, and before we've even started, we're undermined and demonized because we have any level of authority? Is that how governments are supposed to run? Indeed. Says Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim, the deputy high priest, says in Pirkei Avot in chapter 3, that if we don't have respect and fear of the authorities to run our lives, he says if we don't, he says, Chayim belao, people will swallow each other up. And therefore we have to have respect, an inherent respect that society cannot run without forms of authority. And therefore, says Chomsky, and if things don't go your way, he says you dismantle it. But I don't understand. Who's the arbiter? Who decides what is considered a big enough sin to dismantle it? How do we do that? And then all of a sudden people decide wherever they are that now it's worth bringing the house down, and causes tremendous unrest, disobedience, and at times deeply destructive consequences. Nowhere is this ideology clearer in its destructive elements in this week's parasha, how I would call the first biblical anarchist from antiquity, none other than Korach himself. Straight out of Chomsky's playbook, and perhaps Chomsky's playbook comes from this thinking. What does Korach say? We don't need leaders. We don't need authority, right? Why? Kulam kadoshim. Everybody heard God's voice at Mount Sinai. Says Rabbeinu Bechaya. He says, that's his proof. We all heard God's voice. We don't need leaders. He says, Lama titnasu al kal Hashem. Why are you putting yourself above? Like the famous Midrash, which says that he said that a talus of the Midrash puts words in Korach's mouth and says, what was his cogent argument? He said, a talit made out of techelet. Why do you still have to put a patil techelet? The whole thing is holy. He says, he questioned Moshe Rabbeinu, a house full of Sifrei Torah doesn't need a mezuzah. Moshe said it does. Again, you're taking one little thing and giving it the lead role. You don't see that the people are the ikar. And this was his slogan, and this was his ideology. Of course, he was driven by personal ambition as well, which he never spoke about, and the sages speak about, and the psukim speak about. But he was putting forward an anarchist reality. So much so that two of his ardent followers went even further. Datan and Abiram, who said, when Moshe said, come, I want a dialogue, they said, no dialogue. Get out of here. You didn't bring us to the land, the promised land. You brought us to kill us in the desert. Your intent is to kill us. Imagine saying such a thing about Moshe. Ki tistarer aleinu, gam tistarer. That you're trying to have dominion and authority over us. Lo na'aleh, we're not listening to you. And they even wouldn't give, according to the Midrash, the Kohanim, the gifts of the Kohanim, because they said, we're doing our own thing. Lawlessness, civil disobedience, and creating this type of hooliganism and this type of defiance can destroy societies. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. Korach brought destruction on himself and so much of the leadership of the Jewish people because of this overreaching and built on this anarchist destructive ideology. I want to end and say, democracies today are under threat because even though it's the ruler of the majority, so many democracies that we've seen in France and others around the world are going to the extremes. Strong, hard left, strong, hard right. And the more moderate, unifying verses are ideologies are under threat. The problem is that we start seeing elements of anarchy on the extreme left and extreme right, which we have to be very, very careful of, because ultimately, if one undermines the authority and the foundations of society, it ultimately destroys the functioning of a society, as Korach showed, and endangers the whole enterprise. May we, Bezrat Hashem, follow Moshe Rabbeinu's example and not Korach's, the example of authority, whether it's endowed from above or by the people, to follow that authority, to respect the authority, to respect the rule of law, to respect the governance of the country as well, of the state machinations and establishment, because only that way can life exist the way that it should. Change has to happen from within together and not through lawlessness and anarchy. Shabbat Shalom.